The world just witnessed something that no Pentagon press briefing will ever fully explain to you. And if you blink, you'll miss exactly what it means. A small tanker, a few 100,000 barrels of methanol, a Malawian flag on a ship that has never once set foot in Malawi, and a Chinese crew that simply kept sailing. That single image, the rich starry slipping through the Strait of Hormuz while the US Navy stood nearby, is not just a maritime news story, it is a geopolitical signal, a stress test, a live demonstration of every fault line in American global power happening in real time right now in the spring of 2026. And yet most Americans are watching it through a paper-thin media lens that tells them the blockade is working, that America is in control, and that Iran is being squeezed into submission. None of that is entirely true. And the gap between the official story and the real story is exactly where history is being written. So let's talk about what is actually happening in that 21-mile-wide choke point that controls roughly 20% of the world's energy supply, because this is the kind of moment that redraws maps. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the tectonic plates of global power are shifting, and the tremors are being felt from Beijing to Islamabad to Washington to every gas pump in the American heartland. Let's go back to February 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under what they called Operation Epic Fury. The supreme leader was killed, nuclear sites were hit, the whole architecture of the Islamic Republic was targeted in a single campaign. Iran, wounded but not destroyed, did what it had been threatening to do for decades. It closed the Strait of Hormuz, not symbolically, not partially, but operationally. Ships were attacked, crews evacuated, insurance companies stopped writing policies. Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, the juggernauts of global shipping, suspended all transits. And just like that, roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day stopped moving. Brent crude jumped double digits in a single trading session. The IEA, in language it rarely uses, called it the most severe oil supply shock in recorded history. Oil prices posted their single largest monthly gain in March ever. Let that sink in. Now, by early April, the situation had evolved into something even more complex. Pakistan, playing the role of mediator, and let us take a moment to appreciate that. Pakistan, long dismissed in Washington as a difficult ally, stepped onto the world stage and brokered a ceasefire. On April 8th, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced that the United States and Iran had agreed to a ceasefire, effective immediately. But here is where the story gets Byzantine. The ceasefire started unraveling almost before the ink was metaphorically dry. Iran said the strait would open. Israel continued strikes in Lebanon. Iran cited ceasefire violations. Ships were still not moving. And then J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad, sat down with Iranian negotiators, and came back with nothing, empty-handed. The second round of peace talks collapsed on April 12th, and the following morning, Donald Trump announced what he called a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, declaring that no ship paying illegal tolls to Iran would have safe passage on the high seas. Now, here is the critical detail that the mainstream American press glosses over, and it matters enormously. Trump's announcement used sweeping language. Any and all ships, he said, but U.S. Central Command, within hours, clarified that the blockade would only apply to vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports. Ships transiting the strait to non-Iranian destinations would not be impeded. This gap between Trump's declaration and CENTCOM's operational reality is not a minor discrepancy. It is a window into the enormous complexity of enforcing a naval blockade in one of the world's busiest waterways, where the legal, commercial, and geopolitical consequences of stopping the wrong ship are almost incomprehensibly severe. Because when you stop a Chinese tanker, you are not just stopping a tanker, you are potentially starting a new chapter in US-China relations. And that is precisely where the rich story sails into history. The vessel is owned by Shanghai Zhuanrong Shipping Company Limited. It was sanctioned by the United States in 2023 for carrying Iranian oil. It flew a Malawian flag, which is remarkable because Malawi is a landlocked country that has no official registration records for this ship. Its AIS transponder, the device that tells the world where a vessel is, had been spoofing its position for 11 days straight. And yet there it was, broadcasting in plain sight. China owners and crew sailing right through the strait in the early hours of April 14th, 2026, carrying around 250,000 barrels of methanol officially loaded in the UAE, though with a history that tells a very different story. Tanker Trackers, the shipping intelligence firm, called it bluntly The rich starry is a serial AIS spoofer and a designated sanctions violator with a history of transporting Iranian refined products. And it made it through, not dramatically, not with gunfire, it just went through. And then, as if one weren't enough, a second sanctioned Chinese tanker, the Multipolar, flying a Madagascar flag, was also spotted transiting the strait from the opposite direction, heading into the Persian Gulf, bound for Iraq. Madagascar, for reference, is an island nation off the coast of Africa with no obvious maritime relationship with Chinese methanol tankers in the Persian Gulf. These flag of convenience arrangements are a foundational part of how the shadow fleet operates. And that shadow fleet is not some improvised criminal network. It is a sophisticated, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure specifically built to evade Western sanctions. It has been refined through years of pressure on Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. It uses ship-to-ship transfers in international waters near Malaysia. It uses AIS manipulation. It uses layers of shell companies across jurisdictions. And it has made the entire US sanctions architecture look increasingly like a fence with gaps you can drive a supertanker through. Now let's talk about what China actually stands to lose here and why Beijing's behavior is so revealing. China purchases somewhere between 80 and 91% of Iran's total crude oil exports. In 2025, that was roughly 1.38 million barrels per day. Here is the detail that exposes the entire charade. China's own customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022, zero, and yet China's recorded Malaysian crude imports in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, which is more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. The math doesn't work unless you understand that Iranian oil is flowing to China through a laundering process, rebranded as Malaysian crude at sea, the paper trail deliberately confused, the origin officially sanitized. This is not speculation. This is what the shipping data shows. And Washington knows it, has known it for years, and has chosen until now to enforce the sanctions selectively, with secondary sanctions threats and occasional vessel seizures, but never with the kind of direct military confrontation that stopping a Chinese crude tanker in international waters would represent. So when CENTCOM's blockade goes live on April 14th and the rich starry slips through, you have to ask the question, was it a failure of enforcement or was it a deliberate choice? Because the alternative, stopping that vessel, seizing it, holding a Chinese crew, that could trigger a response from Beijing that goes well beyond verbal condemnation. Remember what happened simultaneously. While the United States was deploying more than a dozen warships to enforce this blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, China was moving to block the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Beijing was not just watching events unfold in the Persian Gulf, it was making its own moves on its own chessboard. The message was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. We have our own leverage, and we know where to apply it. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on the offensive, calling China an unreliable partner for holding onto its strategic oil reserves instead of helping ease the global shortage. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for approximately 120 days. Beijing could survive without Iranian crude. The question is whether it wants to. And Beijing's calculation here is deeply rational from its own perspective. Iranian oil arrives at a steep discount, roughly $60 per barrel, compared to market rates well above that, in a period when IMF projections show global growth slowing to 3.1% in 2026 because of this very crisis. China's economy is already under pressure from the broader trade war with the United States, from internal property market stress, from the ripple effects of global energy inflation. Losing cheap Iranian crude is not a neutral event for Beijing, it is economically painful. And China does not accept economic pain quietly. China's foreign ministry was unambiguous. It called the US blockade dangerous and irresponsible behavior that would only intensify contradictions, exacerbate tensions, undermine the already fragile ceasefire, and further jeopardize the security of navigation through the strait. That is diplomatic language, yes, but read between the lines. What China is saying is, you are escalating at the worst possible moment. You are threatening a waterway through which 40% of our oil passes, and we will not simply comply with your unilateral diktat on global shipping. And then to make the point physically, the rich starry sailed through. Now let's talk about the Iranian dimension, because Tehran is not a passive actor in this drama. Iran had already turned the strait into something extraordinary, a tool of economic warfare against the entire global system. Ships were not moving unless they paid tolls exceeding $1 million per transit, processed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, denominated in Chinese yuan, not dollars. When? That detail alone should stop you cold, because it speaks to a payment architecture that deliberately bypasses the dollar system entirely. Iran was not just charging tolls, it was building a precedent for yuan-denominated maritime transit fees on one of the world's most critical energy corridors. That is not an accident, that is strategy. And then on April 17th, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the Strait of Hormuz was open to all shipping traffic, at least for the duration of the ceasefire in Lebanon. Oil prices dropped 11% immediately. The market, exhausted and frightened, exhaled. But notice what Trump said almost simultaneously. The strait may be open, but the US naval blockade will remain in place until negotiations with Iran have concluded. So now you have two powers, both declaring something, neither fully in control of the situation, with Chinese tankers testing the boundaries and a ceasefire that has already been violated multiple times by both sides. The deeper story here is about the architecture of American power itself. The United States has built its global order on three interlocking pillars: military supremacy, dollar dominance, and the ability to enforce sanctions unilaterally against any actor it chooses. The Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026 is stress testing all three simultaneously. The military is deployed, more than a dozen warships, mines being cleared, destroyers in the strait, but ships are still getting through. The dollar is under pressure because Iran and its partners are transacting in yuan. And sanctions, the supposedly sharpest tool in the American toolkit, are being navigated around by a shadow fleet that was built specifically to circumvent them. There is a famous expression that a blockade you cannot fully enforce is worse than no blockade, because it reveals the limits of your power without destroying the target. And here is the thing about power vacuums: they get filled. While Washington is consumed with the Hormuz crisis, with domestic energy prices spiking, with gas prices that Republican senators are now openly telling Americans to simply accept in the name of national security, the rest of the world is reorganizing. Countries like India and Malaysia are navigating their own paths through this crisis, seeking Iranian permission to transit the strait, hedging between Washington and Tehran. Pakistan has emerged as a genuine diplomatic power broker. Germany's Friedrich Merz offered to contribute to freedom of navigation in the strait if the necessary conditions are met, which is the language of a European continent that is increasingly uncertain about how closely to tie its security architecture to American decisions. The international order that Washington built after 1945 and that it reinforced after 1991 is showing cracks that no amount of carrier groups can fill. What Americans deserve to understand, and what the coverage of this story consistently fails to provide, is that the rich story is not just a tanker. It is a symbol of the emerging multipolar world expressing itself in real time. A Chinese-crewed, Malawi-flagged AIS spoofing vessel that carries Iranian hydrocarbons under a paper trail routed through Malaysia, sailing through a blockade announced by the most powerful military on earth, through a strait where Iran charges tolls in Chinese yuan during a ceasefire mediated by Pakistan. Every element of that sentence is an entire geopolitical story in itself. Put them together, and you are looking at a portrait of the 21st century as it actually exists, not as Washington wishes it did. The ceasefire clock is ticking, the shadow fleet is probing. Beijing is watching the Scarborough Shoal, and somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, another tanker is waiting to see what happens next.